This evening I'm going to talk about a disease which is very common, is, as we'll go through, very serious, and some people in the audience will have diabetes. All of you will know people who've got diabetes, whether they've told you or not. This is a disease that is very common indeed. And it's a disease which at the moment around the world is increasing. Most of the areas I've talked about up to this point have been diseases where things are going the right way. You could argue in diabetes that things are going the wrong way, though for reasons I'll come on to, in fact, it's a rather more mixed picture than that, fortunately. Diabetes is an old disease. It's not a disease just of the modern era. The first reasonably clear description of it goes back to 1552 BC from the Egyptians, and there were other descriptions of a disease that was probably diabetes where, for example, people's urine attracted ants because of the sugar in it. Probably the most colourful description of untreated diabetes was by Aretius in 150 AD, who described the melting of flesh into urine. And the early diagnosis actually involved tasting urine. A link with exercise and diet was made very early on, although to be fair, virtually every disease was linked with exercise and diet at that stage because there wasn't much else to do. So I think we probably should not overinterpret that. And there was a recognition that there were two types of diabetes at least, as early as about 1770s. In one group, there were a group of people who got the symptoms of diabetes, which we'll come on to, and they died really very soon after that. And this is what we would call type 1 diabetes. And in the second, survival was quite a lot longer, and diet might help. And there were good evidence of this, particularly during war, in fact. And this is what we would call type 2 diabetes. Now, we don't know how much diabetes there was in previous eras because the tests are biochemical tests, which we'll come on to. But it seems very likely that the amount of type 2 diabetes, which is linked with particularly obesity and being overweight, was much lower in historical eras when this college was founded and really until relatively recently. And I've put on this a graph looking at sugar consumption in kilograms per individual. The white dots are the UK, black dots are the USA. And what you can see is that significant amounts of sugar consumption did not really start until about the 1850s and didn't properly take off until the beginning of the last century. So during that era, it is likely that diabetes, which is not driven just by sugar, but sugar is a major part of what leads to obesity, was really pretty rare in terms of type 2 diabetes at that stage. It is likely, however, that type 1 diabetes has been at roughly the same rate all the way through history. Now, there are some important scientific milestones, and the first one, probably, is the description of what is called the islets of Langerhans, done by Paul Langerhans, a doctoral student. And he described these cells, these clear cells in the pancreas, which are still called the islets of Langerhans after him. 20 years later, two scientists showed that if you remove the pancreas from a dog, the dog would go on to get very classical diabetes. And that was the first real clear link between the pancreas, a gland in the abdomen, and diabetes. The breakthrough, however, was in 1922, and just the period leading up to this. So this is less than 100 years ago. And a group of 4 Canadian scientists, Banting, Best, MacLeod, and Collip, extracted and then purified insulin. And insulin is the key drug in the treatment of severe diabetes. And we'll come back to insulin lots and lots of times. And they gave it to a child, Leonard Thompson, then aged 14, who was lapsing in and out of diabetic coma and who undoubtedly would have died without this treatment. Thompson, the first person to be treated for what was up to that point in time a universally fatal disease, type 1 diabetes, went on to live another 13 years, which in that era was not an unreasonable period of time, in fact, to live. And Banting and MacLeod, entirely justifiably, were awarded the Nobel Prize and shared it with their co-workers for one of the great medical discoveries of history. Now, I cannot stress too much that diabetes is common. An estimated 4.3 million people in the UK are living with diabetes, and around 3.5 million of them are diagnosed, meaning that some of them are not diagnosed but are out living their lives. And globally, over 400 million cases of diabetes are thought to be there by the World Health Organization. So this is a very common disease. And it happens in absolutely all walks of life. And the second thing I would like to stress is that most people with diabetes go on to live for long periods and often for a very, very full and long life, a very normal and productive life not defined by their diabetes. I've illustrated this here with 4 famous people, 2 from the arts, 1 from sports and 1 from politics, all of whom have talked about their diabetes. This is not breaking any medical confidences, and all of whom are clearly people at the absolute top of their game in each of their areas of influence. So this is not a disease for those who actually acquire the diagnosis where you think, actually, this is the end of my life as a sports person, as a scientist, as a teacher, as a politician, as an actor. But diabetes has undoubtedly been steadily rising, not just in the UK, but globally over quite a long period of time. And this is both in total numbers and as a proportion of the amount of disease that is here in the UK. This is an international study, the Global Burden of Disease Study. And what that shows is that since 1990, so over a relatively short period of time, diabetes has gone from the 14th most common to the 8th most common cause of morbidity, which is ill health. And that is a combination of the fact diabetes is going up and that other causes of diabetes are going down. So other causes of disease are going down, meaning that proportionately diabetes is becoming more important. So this is a problem we have to take very seriously. It's very common, as we'll come on to, it is very severe if not treated properly, but it can be treated properly, and it is rising as a proportion and in absolute numbers in this country and many countries around the world. Now, a little bit of the physiology, and some of this for many of you, will be going back to your days at school. Some of you it won't. The physiology of diabetes and glucose control is complicated, but the essence of it is very simple. The body needs to keep glucose, the key sugar that we have circulating in our blood, within a relatively narrow range. If you have too much glucose circulating, you get the problems of diabetes that we'll be coming on to later in the talk. If you have too little diabetes circulating, all the vital organs of the body, in particular the brain, but also kidneys and many other organs, start to malfunction. And if you have low glucose for too long, it is extremely dangerous. And this is, in fact, one of the major hazards of the treatment of diabetes. So too much diabetes, bad. Too little diabetes, bad. What you want is just right. It's like Goldilocks. The way that this is controlled, and the main bit that actually is relevant to diabetes, is that the pancreas, which is the gland in the abdomen which actually controls glucose primarily, has some cells, these beta cells, in the islets that we talked about earlier on. And when the blood sugar goes too high, they produce the hormone insulin, and the insulin then communicates with cells throughout the body, telling them to go and store their blood, so store the energy, store the glucose in different ways. It's in the liver. It's stored in a form which you can actually get hold of really quite quickly. It's stored in fat cells, in fat, obviously. It's stored in muscle, where it often leads to build-up of muscle, and so on. So the response of the body to insulin is to store glucose and therefore pull the glucose level down in the blood. There are other bits of the system, but that's the key one for understanding diabetes. Now, I've talked about these 2 different types of diabetes, and I think it's important to understand that although they do many of the same things, they are 2 very different diseases. And my guess would be that if we looked over time, we'll probably stop calling them 2 diseases and see them as multiple diseases, but they are broadly 2 disease types. The first is what's called type 1 diabetes, and it's around 10% of diabetes these days, would have been more historically. And in this, remember that the pancreas produces the insulin from the beta cells. And in type 1 diabetes, these at an early stage of life usually, often in childhood or in early adulthood, start to die off. And we think that this is probably an autoimmune disease. And so you move from a situation where you've got these cells which respond to glucose by producing insulin, and little by little they die out, till you get to the point there's almost no insulin or no insulin at all. That is type 1 diabetes. The body itself responds to insulin absolutely fine. So the problem is no insulin because there are no cells to produce it in type 1 diabetes. Once those cells have gone, they stay gone. And obviously we're looking in science to try and improve on that, and I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. Then you have type 2 diabetes. And in type 2 diabetes, the pancreas does produce insulin, although it may produce less insulin than is needed. But the body also responds abnormally to this insulin, and it doesn't reduce the glucose as much as it should, given the insulin stimulation it's got. So either too little insulin, body not responding, what's called insulin resistance, or a combination of both. But the effect, again, is that glucose goes up. So the end result is the same, irrespective of the cause. Now, if you look at the UK, and this would be typical for most developed countries, the age structure of type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes are very different. This is the age structure for type 1 diabetes, and each of these is an age band, a 5-year age band, going all the way up to old age. And what you can see is that it comes on relatively early in life, and then will stay with people right till towards the end of their life. In type 2 diabetes, young people rarely get type 2 diabetes, although it does occasionally happen. It tends to come on in middle age or later. And then again, in most people, it stays, although not in absolutely all, as we'll come back to. So very different age structure, a different basis in terms of the physiology. And then there's a third form of diabetes, which I'm not going to talk about very much, but I think it is important, which is called gestational diabetes. And this is what happens in people who are pregnant, who don't normally have diabetes. But when they're pregnant, around 5% of people will go on to get diabetes during the period they're pregnant, usually in the second and third trimesters. And it usually resolves after the child is born. But importantly, there's about a 7 times increased risk of those ladies subsequently developing type 2 diabetes later in their life. So having this is a problem during the pregnancy, but it also is a marker that people could go on to get diabetes, and it's certainly a suggestion that people should watch their weight really very carefully. And additionally, diabetes in people going into pregnancy is increasing all the time at the moment, and that's again for 2 reasons, partly because people are surviving better with diabetes, there's more diabetes, but also because people are accepting that diabetes is a risk that can be managed through pregnancy, although it is dangerous in pregnancy, and people who are pregnant with diabetes tend to be monitored very closely. So 3 forms of diabetes: type 1, type 2, and gestational, slightly different diseases. When people get the diagnosis of diabetes, obviously their first worry is that this is the end of their working or enjoyable life, and the answer clearly is absolutely not. One of the second worries for many people is, will I pass this on to my children? Is this a genetic problem? And the answer is yes, a bit, but not in the way that is normally understood by most people. So 85% of people who've got diabetes do not have a first-degree relative, an immediate family member, who is affected. So on that score, you could say not a very strong association. But on the other hand, if you do have someone with type 1 diabetes, your risk is about 15 times higher from a very low base than it would be if you did not have one. And so what this means is that if you have a mother who's got type 1 diabetes, your chance of going on to get type 1 diabetes is about 2 to 3%. And if your father has diabetes, it's slightly higher than that, 6 to 9%. If both of them have type 1 diabetes, then around 30% go on. So there clearly is a genetic link. And if you've got identical twins, there's somewhere between a 30 and 70% chance that if one of them gets diabetes, the other will get diabetes. So what that tells you is not an immediate inheritance. Most people who've got diabetes, their children will not have diabetes by quite some distance. There is a genetic link, but clearly it is not completely genetic, because if it was, identical twins would both get diabetes. So there is some genes and there is some environment for type 1 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes, a much less clear link. It certainly clusters in families, but it's a complicated relationship. It's between 2 and 6 times more likely that you will have type 2 diabetes if you've got a family member with it, but this may not all be genes. Families all tend to live together, fairly obviously, eat together, behave similarly, so behavioural elements may well also explain why there's clustering in families. So it probably is some combination of genes and behaviours. A broad group, which is important to understand have an increased risk, is different ethnic groups. And here in the UK, we're fortunate to have several ethnic groups, and they have different rates of diabetes. If you look at childhood type 2 diabetes, and this is type 2 diabetes we're talking about, not type 1, children of Asian origin are roughly 9 times more likely to have type 2 diabetes than their white counterparts, but this is from a very, very low risk. And children of African heritage, roughly 6 times more likely. That's a rare disease. But in adulthood, South Asian and people of African heritage, and by heritage I mean include people who, for example, from the Caribbean but have African genes, are more likely to develop type 2 diabetes, roughly 2 to 4 times as more likely. Middle East similarly. And they're also at higher risk of gestational diabetes. So some genetic link and some ethnic link in the population. And so looking here in London, where Gresham College is based, there are significant differences at every age group between different, how common diabetes is in different ethnic groups. So much lower rates in people of white ethnic origin than people of African origin or Afro-Caribbean origin and South Asian origin. So a very strong link. And this is part of the reason why people of South Asian origin, for example, have higher rates of heart attack and stroke, which is a major risk, and most people who work in the NHS recognise that. Now, other than these broad genetic issues, the major risk for type 2 diabetes is being overweight or obese. And current estimates are that between 80 and 85% of type 2 diabetes is accounted for by people being overweight or obese. And this increases with level of deprivation in society, socioeconomic status as it's often called, which is different from type 1 diabetes, where there really is very little deprivation association. Interestingly and importantly, where people sometimes say, well, maybe that's just because what causes obesity, what causes diabetes have some similarities, but they're not linked. When people with type 2 diabetes lose weight, many of them will have their blood sugar go down, and some indeed may move back to a situation where they do not have diabetes. So the link, I think, is pretty clearly causal in many cases, not in all. And if you look at trends in diabetes, and I've used US data here, most of the increase over time is in those with a significant high body mass index. So these are people who would conventionally be termed obese, although I don't find the term terribly helpful. And there's a clear gradation between people who are normal weight, overweight, and obese by how common diabetes type 2 is. So obesity and type 2 diabetes, very heavily associated. Now, because of that, in part, the prevalence, that is how common type 2 diabetes is, has risen very rapidly from the 1960s through to now. And these are estimates from 2009, and I've deliberately chosen 2009 because, in fact, what's happened isn't exactly what was projected to happen. But we saw a very significant increase in the number of patients in the UK who had type 2 diabetes, from really very small numbers relative to now, down in 1960, through to substantial numbers 10 years ago. Now, there are 3 possible reasons for seeing this, and in fact, the reality is that all 3 of them are important. The first is there has been rising obesity over that time, and I'm going to come on to that at the end of this talk when I'm talking about what we can do about it. The second is that there have been undoubtedly changes in medical practice and changes in the way that people diagnose diabetes. And I'm glad, the good thing is that more people with diabetes are being picked up by their GPs or by doctors and nurses in the system. But the third reason, which is also important, is that survival is better. So people who actually have diabetes are living longer, and therefore they are contributing more to society, but they're also contributing more to the total number of people who have diabetes. And that last one, I think, is often underestimated, and I'm going to show some data from the last few years to demonstrate that this is actually really important. What's happened to obesity over the last, in the UK? Well, over the last 2 decades, it's risen from about 15% to 26%, depending on gender, slight variation, but that's overall the numbers. But it's been broadly stable, actually, over the last few years. You wouldn't believe that if you read the newspapers, but in fact, the increase in obesity has actually leveled off over the last few years. Doesn't mean that'll continue. Obviously, we worry that it'll continue to increase over time. What's happened to prevalence, that's how many people have got diabetes, and incidence, that's how many new cases of diabetes there are. If you look at the prevalence numbers, it looks pretty scary. The number of cases of diabetes in every age group, the lower ones are the lowest age group, right up to people who are over 75, has been increasing. But actually, if you look at the incidence, the number of people who've got new diagnoses of diabetes, they are in fact going down. Slightly, but they are going down. And if you look across all the countries of the United Kingdom, this pattern is repeated. These, for example, are data from Scotland, and here I'm cutting it slightly differently, not by age, but here by deprivation index. And what you can see is that particularly in women, there has been a clear trend towards the new cases of diabetes actually going down over time. And on the other side, if you look at the mortality from diabetes, how many people are dying, there is, again, really clear evidence, and I'll show it from multiple angles, that mortality rates in people who've got diabetes are dropping really quite substantially year on year. So the incidence, the mortality rates, fell from about 319 per 10,000 person years at risk, which is just a measure, down to about 216 over the period 2004 to 2014. That's just over a decade. That's a substantial reduction in mortality. The incidence, which is the new cases, have either stayed flat or slightly fallen, but the prevalence has gone up, and that's because these people are surviving. So actually the increase in diabetes is partially good news. It's because of better survival among people who've got diabetes. Now I'd like to talk a bit about diabetes, and this is aimed in particular at people who've had a recent diagnosis of diabetes or know someone who has, and they just want to understand a few of the basics. For those who've lived with diabetes for many years, this will be very familiar stuff. Untreated diabetes, so this is before you treat it, and this is true whether you're talking about type 1 or type 2, although type 1 comes on much more rapidly and dramatically. The symptoms include going to pass urine frequently with thirst, just passing urine without thirst usually has other causes, tiredness, weight loss, skin infections, thrush that you're not expecting, and delayed wound healing. Most people who have one of these probably doesn't have diabetes, but if you do have one of these symptoms, you should get yourself checked out, because this is an early sign of potentially of diabetes, and if so, you want to pick it up quickly. In untreated diabetes, there are also some emergency presentations where people actually turn up at hospital not with these relatively minor, although in the long term serious symptoms, but really life-threateningly ill. And there are two in particular it's worth being aware of. The first of which is called diabetic ketoacidosis, shortened to DKA. This is almost always in type 1 diabetes, and it's usually, but not always, in people who haven't been diagnosed. So the first time they know they got diabetes is when they start to get very, very ill indeed, rush to hospital, and people discover they got this. And what happens is their blood glucose, because they got almost no insulin, goes really, really high, and additionally, some chemicals which are quite dangerous, called ketones, build up on the body, and the blood becomes acidic. This combination is extremely dangerous, and untreated, they will lapse into coma, and untreated in coma, they will go on to die relatively quickly. This is a very serious medical emergency. There is an equivalent thing which you can get much less commonly in type 2 diabetes, or type 1 diabetes sufferers can also have it, and that's where you have a very high, very life-threateningly high level of glucose, multiples of the normal glucose level, but without ketones and usually without acid. And this is usually triggered by illness or infection. So these are the two emergencies which people who work in accident and emergency and acute medicine will see relatively commonly. Now, what prevents that, and the key to treatment of type 1 diabetes and some people with type 2 diabetes, is insulin. It was the first drug, and it's the most important drug. It is, very simply, the actual cause of the diabetes is not having enough insulin, and you just replace it. And the key thing with insulin was, firstly, multiple injections of short-acting insulin had to be used, and then scientists relatively early discovered ways of making these long-acting. So you could have short-acting insulin, which you could give during meal times or around meal times, and you could give long-acting insulin, which would cover you for the rest of the day. And the aim of this was to keep your blood glucose as normal as possible. And you can give it by injection, by what's called a pen, which you'll see, many of you will have seen friends doing this around their meal times, and you can give it also by a pump, and increasingly I think that is the way much insulin will be given. The thing you have to be careful of is either not giving the insulin, in which case the blood glucose goes too high, or if people give too much insulin for the amount that they're eating, their blood glucose can go too low, and they can lapse into coma because their brain is being starved of glucose. If someone's diabetic and they lapse into to coma or start becoming very drowsy, one of the first things you just think about is, are they short on sugar? And you should replace that as a matter of urgency. If you look at what happens to insulin through the day, it mirrors to some degree what happens to glucose through the day. So the red line is the glucose through the day, and the blue line is the insulin levels. And what we're trying to do when we're using a combination of short-acting and long-acting insulin is to mimic what happens naturally as closely as we can. Now, we can't get absolutely perfectly to match what would happen if the pancreas was happening normally. And one of the main things we're trying to do, as we'll come on to with some of the more modern ways of delivering insulin, is to get much closer to natural levels of insulin through the day, which includes, for insulin, an oscillation that happens up and down over relatively short periods of time to stop the cells of the body becoming too used to it. But insulin is not the only form of treatment, and for people who've got type 2 diabetes, where their pancreas is still able to produce insulin, and so there is some functional reserve still, we can also use oral drugs. And most people who have got type 2 diabetes are either managed on diet or managed on oral drugs most of the time. Some go on to insulin, but most, initially at least, do not. And they work by multiple different mechanisms, and more drugs are being found all the time. Three important groups, and there are some groups which have begun to fall out of favour. The first one are ones that stimulate the pancreas directly to release more insulin. And an important group of those, one of the oldest but still around, is a drug class called the sulfonylureas. Then there's a group of drugs, but in particular the most important one, because it's standard treatment almost everywhere in the world, is something called metformin, and they don't affect the pancreas directly, but what they do is they decrease glucose production in the liver. They do other things as well, but that's their most important effect. And the third area is a group of drugs which stop the gut from producing enzymes which reduce glucose by several steps and stimulate the pancreas. And I'll go through each of these in slightly more detail. But there are others. So there's quite a lot of different ways you can achieve what you're trying to achieve, which is to get blood glucose back to normal level. There isn't just one route. And sometimes one drug class suits one person and doesn't suit another. Now, the way in which these drugs were developed is, like much of science, often quite accidental. And I'm taking two examples of largely accidental discovery. The first one for metformin, the first standard line drug for almost everyone with type 2 diabetes. This drug, which comes originally by several removes from French lilac, also known as goat's rue, this drug was used in traditional medical practice for very long periods of time. And people looked at derivatives from it, and what they found is some of the derivatives reduced sugar in rabbits. This was just an observation. There was no reason to understand how it happened. And from this, eventually, the drug class metformin that metformin comes from was produced. And they've been used in diabetes since essentially the late 1950s. A second drug class that was produced by accident was the sulfonylureas, one of the other major drug classes. And this was discovered by chance when a scientist was testing sulfonylurea antibiotics, which are still used but were very common recently, against typhoid, in fact. And what they found was that this drug class also had effects on the body which led to glucose going down. And from this group of antibiotics derived this group of drugs which stimulate the pancreas. So these are just, in a sense, chance observations for people who are actually looking for other things completely. And then there are drugs, for example, this group, the DPP-4I drugs, which are a relatively recent drug class, which are produced by the way that most people understand science to work, following a conventional scientific pathway. Quite a lot of drugs in this class now. They work indirectly, and what they do is they prevent the breakdown of the enzyme, the enzyme group incretins, and these have an effect on glucose both by stimulation of insulin release and inhibiting another important enzyme called glucagon. Both of those have the effect of lowering glucose. So several different drug classes work by different areas, some of them accidentally discovered, some of them discovered by science along conventional routes. Now, if you've got type 1 or type 2 diabetes, there are several major risks without good glucose control. And I'll go through each of these in turn. These include heart disease and heart attacks, stroke, eye disease and blindness, skin infections and peripheral vascular disease, nerve damage, kidney damage, and serious infections. There are others as well. These are serious diseases, if not properly managed. But again, there is good news. There has been a really very substantial reduction in the complications from diabetes. I've got here some US data. I'm going to show you some other data from elsewhere later. And if you look at almost all of these risks and compare now to 1995, there has been a reduction, and in some cases, a massive reduction in the amount of risk that people have got over time as we have got better at managing these conditions. Start off with diabetic retinopathy. This is something where the blood vessels in particular in the back of the eye are damaged and you get some exudates in the back of the eye. Here you can see a relatively mild case, this yellow shouldn't be here. Here you can see a very severe case with blood, flame hemorrhages and various exudates around here. If these tend to happen in people after prolonged, not very well managed diabetes. Some eye changes are relatively common in many people, but if they go on for long enough, they start to threaten vision. And diabetes remains one of the major causes of loss of sight. What we do know from data that are relatively old but haven't really been bettered is that if you control blood sugar more effectively, if you basically take the blood sugar down, the rate of retinal change progressions substantially slows down. So this graph is from a relatively old but a very important study that compared conventional treatment, showing the percentage of patients over years who got eye disease, and those who had intensive treatment, where the eye disease slowed down really very substantially. So treatment makes a difference, and if you look more recently at data from follow-up from this, what you see is that this difference is maintained over time. So this is not just a temporary effect. So control of glucose is good for eye outcomes. But, and there's a but in this, the difficulty is balancing control of glucose, which helps to reduce the eye getting worse, and the risk that people, which means that as the glucose goes up over time, what's called glycosylated hemoglobin, which is a measure of medium-term glucose levels, goes up, the proportion of people with eye disease goes up, But the more tightly you control the glucose, the more likely it is that people will get hypos, which are these things where they get very low blood sugar, which can damage particularly the brain and can be very dangerous. So you're always walking a tightrope between too tight glucose control with the risk of hypos and not tight enough, meaning you're going to go on to get problems with the eye. Now, for those who are unfortunate and go on to get eye disease, there are two broad areas of treatment. There are others, but these are probably now the most important ones. The first one, which is actually relatively long-standing, is laser therapy. And what people do is a relatively crude, actually, thing where lasers are fired in a pattern around the eye. All these white dots are laser blasts, and they're there to stop blood vessels from proliferating and damaging the sight. More recent treatment is injecting a drug class, the anti-VEGF drug class, into the eye. This looks incredibly painful. Actually, it isn't, let me assure you. I'm assured by people who've had it done. I haven't had it done myself. This usually an antibody, slows down the development of blood vessels in the eye and can also reduce, in some cases reduce and certainly slow down diabetic eye disease. So there are things you can do. Clearly, though, what you want to do is not get to that state in the first place, which is where the tight glucose control comes in. The next group of things to consider are foot ulcers, and these sound trivial. I want to be clear that they are not. So at any given time in the UK, around 60,000 people with diabetes have foot ulcers, and it is actually a bad prognostic sign. That means that if people have got them, the outlook for a whole lot of other areas of diabetes is less good. They're a big issue. They probably cost around £1 billion a year. These are really non-serious, trivial sums. And if they go on for long enough, they can get badly infected and people may have to go on to have amputations, which is a bad situation. If people have an amputation of the foot because of a foot ulcer that's gone too far, only about half survive more than 2 years. It's not that they die of the amputation, but it's a sign that the diabetes has got out of control. As with the eye disease, good glucose control will reduce amputations significantly in type 2 diabetes. And there are various studies that do this. I'm not going to go through all the numbers. But so like the eye, the key to this in the long term is good glucose control. And then when people get foot infections, aggressive treatment with antibiotics and good foot care with podiatrists and others. So there's a whole bunch of things that need to be done to protect people's feet in diabetes. There is a very considerable variation in the rate of amputation of bits of feet or feet across the UK. And this worries all of us because this shouldn't really be happening to the degree that it is. And there may be multiple reasons why certain parts of the country have much higher amputation rates, which I would see as a sign of failure to some degree, at least in the short to medium term. These include a delayed diagnosis of diabetes, so people just aren't picked up early enough, less good glucose control over time, less good foot care, so people aren't looking after their feet properly, aren't helping to look at the shoes and so on. Delayed presentation of foot problems. People just haven't realised that this is a very serious problem. They think, let's not bother the doctor. Less effective use of non-invasive treatments, and there are a variety of treatments that can be used, including things like artery bypasses, and local surgical practice. So lots of different things can contribute to this, but wherever you see high amputation rates, you should be asking what's gone wrong. And then there's disease of the kidney, and diabetes is one of the leading causes of kidney disease and renal failure. Again, tight glucose control probably delays the onset of this disease, but probably not its progression once you've got it. So what I've said is tight glucose control, tight glucose control, tight glucose control. But once you've got this, it won't probably make a big difference to the renal failure. It may to other things. What does make a difference, however, is controlling blood pressure. And really strong control of blood pressure in people who've got diabetes is critical to help protect their kidneys in the long run. And then there's infections. And there's a very significant increase of risk of infections of all sorts. What I've shown here is data from the urinary tract, and this is this is not particularly surprising. People who've got diabetes tend to have more sugar in their urine. That's good for bugs, and therefore they get more urinary tract infections. What's probably less obvious why it happens is, for example, they have much higher rates of complications if, for example, they get flu. So if you've got diabetes and you have influenza, your chance of getting a proper lung infection afterwards, dangerous lung infection, is significantly higher than if you don't have diabetes. One of the reasons that we recommend strongly that people with diabetes get a influenza vaccination to reduce their risk of flu in the first place. So infections are another group. And finally, there are other things, but the final one I want to consider is cardiovascular disease. And here actually the news is both good and bad. The bad news is that patients with type 1 diabetes and with type 2 diabetes have significantly higher rates of both heart attack and stroke than people of the same age over time who do not have those. The good news is that if you compare what's happened since the turn of the century, there has been a substantial reduction in mortality from heart disease and stroke. And this is a study that came out very recently in the New England Journal of Medicine. 36,800 patients with type 1 diabetes, almost 500,000 patients with type 2 diabetes. And what that demonstrates really clearly is a 42% reduction in mortality in people with type 1 and a 46% reduction in mortality in people with type 2. We are getting a lot better at managing this. Now, in contrast to the other things I've talked about, which are largely about glucose control, for the cardiovascular disease, the big things are not glucose control. Actually, there doesn't seem to be a very strong signal from glucose control. The big things are controlling all the other things. Stopping smoking. If you smoke and have diabetes, you are really asking for trouble. There are multiple problems that will happen very quickly, unfortunately. But also blood pressure control, cholesterol lowering, these ACE inhibitor drugs, beta blockers, which sometimes useful, aspirin, exercise, simple thing, but exercise in diabetes is a very, very important part of the management of diabetes, and more modern treatments like stenting of the coronary arteries, which I talked about in a previous talk. So the combination of these things, and there are many others, all based on small scientific advances all stacked up, have led to substantial improvements in diabetes mortality. And if you look at these graphs, I see no sign of them flattening out. I'm expecting mortality from diabetes to continue to fall over the next 2 decades. So by attention to detail and incremental scientific advances, diabetes mortality overall, not just cardiovascular, is falling. So all-cause mortality has gone down by about 30% over time, and in type 2 diabetes, it's gone down by about 21% over 15 years. So there is good news in diabetes, actually, quite substantially good news. Things are definitely improving. Now, can we do things to actually treat diabetes, take people who've got diabetes and stop them having diabetes? And the answer is yes, in a few cases, or some cases, a lot of cases, depending on which group you're talking about, if they've got type 2 diabetes. Currently, we do not have ways we can treat people with type 1 diabetes, although I'm reasonably confident that someone giving a similar talk in 30 years will give a different answer. And at this point, for type 2 diabetes, the key thing is to lose weight. If people lose weight, many people who've got type 2 diabetes will go back to not having diabetes. An extreme version of this is what's called bariatric surgery. And this is where, by a number of methods, there are several surgical ways of doing it, but by essentially replumbing the stomach and the upper gut, we actually bypass the stomach or reduce the amount of gut which actually is absorbing things. And what we find is that this surgery, it leads to weight loss, but even before it leads to weight loss, it leads to dramatic improvements in glucose control, which once people have had the surgery, they no longer have diabetes. And in many cases, probably the majority of cases actually, that improvement is sustained. Now, this is going to be some combination of losing weight and the fact that the gut hormones are being shifted around by the way that it's managed surgically. But what this does demonstrate is that under certain circumstances, type 2 diabetes actually can be cured, although clearly losing weight by non-dramatic methods is much better. There are risks to bariatric surgery. It's not something you'd undertake unless you absolutely had to. All of us have seen complications of it. Finally, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the public health on this. The prevalence of obesity is now substantial in many parts of the world. The UK has got significant amounts of obesity. The darker the colour, the more there is. But we don't have the greatest in the world. The USA, South Africa, Middle East, all areas where obesity rates are even higher than our own. But they have risen everywhere. And if you look at fasting blood glucose, unsurprisingly, that is higher in many of the areas where there is both obesity and you've got a group who are genetically predisposed to get diabetes, which includes people of Middle Eastern origin and people of African heritage. So the rates of diabetes globally are going up very substantially. These are some data that came out a couple of weeks ago and got a lot of media attention because they made the point that within the wealthy countries, England was, to use the newspaper treatment of this, one of the fattest countries in the world, among the wealthy countries. And what they did with this is rather scary projection up, where the England rate continues to rise. Actually, I think the data do not support that personally. But what certainly it is the case is that here in the UK, we do have significantly more obesity than most other wealthy countries. And it'll take Spain, France, Switzerland, Italy many years to catch up with us if they carry on their current trajectory. It'll take Korea or Japan, for example, many decades. So we have a particular problem among the wealthy countries. And this is in particularly true among children and adolescents, which is a group we need to worry about a lot. Once you put weight on, as anyone who's found this, taking it off again is really difficult. So the key is to try and not put it on in the first place. Now, there are two sides to this. Exercise, which is what people all tend to think about and what indeed much of industry would like you to think about, and food. And my final points on this are that I think that we, the public, need to engage with the food industry on this. This is a photograph I took last weekend at my local supermarket. It's a perfectly ordinary supermarket. Every single thing on that shelf has sugar added, substantial amounts of sugar added. Much of it is marketed as healthy. All of this is straight sweets. Next aisle along. Is it surprising that people who actually like having sweet things go into a supermarket and eat large amounts of sugar, which will go on to increase their weight and will go on to increase their risk of diabetes? Answer, pretty obviously, no. But clearly what we need to do is balance three different things. Pleasure, we want people to continue to enjoy sweet things, enjoy treats. Profits, we're not trying to force supermarkets to lose money. That would be stupid. Fighting the market very seldom works. And health. And in my view, they are not in any way mutually incompatible. All we need to do is find a way where all three of those can be maintained simultaneously. It undoubtedly, though, needs a very different approach to the one we have at the moment. Now, one of the things that is a barrier to this is that noises off from some bits of the media do not tend to support making public health interventions. I really wouldn't try and get all your diabetes advice from the newspaper headlines. I've unfairly singled out the Daily Express just because they put it on the front page. There are many others which actually give equally misleading. Only one of these statements, all of these statements have a little bit of truth in them, but only one of them is not misleading, and it's this one. I really do, if anybody thinks that eating chocolate can beat diabetes, then they really probably have not had any education at all. But what this means is because there tends to be a lot of pressure from the media not to have state intervention, you'll immediately get cries of nanny state. Politicians who represent the public can often shy away from what is a difficult subject. And that is because nobody wants to be the person who takes people's treats away from them. Why should you? And I absolutely agree with that. I want to be clear about that. And there is a ladder of state intervention for all public health interventions, starting up with leave it up to individuals. Don't worry about it, which should be the default. Inform them that there's a problem, but don't do more. Engage with industry, moving all the way up to taxing heavily and banning. And I think as a public, we have to make a decision about whether we wish to move up this ladder of regulation or not. This is a public decision. It's not for the medical profession to determine this. This is for the public through politicians to determine this. But I think it is really clear that diabetes is a very substantial problem, has very substantial health effects, and is rising. And therefore, I think we need to look at this reasonably seriously. And if we're going to do it reasonably seriously, we're going to need multiple interventions, all of which will have a modest, but if you put them all together, incrementally, a big impact. We don't yet know the optimal mix. I want to be clear about that. The data on this is much less clear than, for example, for smoking, where the answer is don't smoke at all. This is a much harder area. But examples of possible state interventions include things like sugar tax on fizzy drinks, traffic light labelling of foods, restricting direct advertising to children, and restricting fast food outlets near schools. But there are many others. They would also be on the exercise side. In my view, the best way to do things is lots of small interventions that don't have too bad an impact on people's lives than 2 or 3 big ones that they find a lot more difficult to adjust to. And the aim, and I cannot stress this too strongly, is not to reduce enjoyment, only to reduce unnecessary energy intake. Here are 2 things I quite like, Greek yogurt and Coke. The difference between a zero-fat and an ordinary Greek yogurt is substantial in terms of the amount of fat I would eat. They basically taste almost the same. The difference between this one, 54 grams of sugar, this is what you're drinking if you drink a bottle of full-fat Coke, and this one, the Diet Coke, is substantial if you have lots of them. So lots of things we can do where we can enjoy things just as much but eat much less energy, whether it's in fat or in sugar. Finally, what are the new directions in science for treatment and prevention? And these are occurring all the time. I haven't majored on these, largely because I do not know, and nobody honestly knows, which of these is actually going to be in widespread use in 20 to 30 years, and which of these are essentially very interesting science that is broadly speculative. All of them are used a little bit in very niche indications. There's islet cell transplant. Remember, these are the cells that produce insulin. And there are situations it is possible to take some of those cells and transplant them, but there are significant problems with getting that properly to work. There's having a full pancreas transplant, and that again is used in a limited number of situations, particularly with people who've got complete renal failure. Again, significant issues around this, but this is used already in some situations. We're getting better at it the whole time. We know that the early stage of type 1 diabetes is probably an immune phenomenon, autoimmune phenomenon, and therefore the hope is if we can start to spot someone getting type 1 diabetes early, we could actually intervene to stop that process before it gets to the point they've lost all of the cells in their pancreas. And again, there are several lines of research trying to improve this. There are low-calorie diets to put type 2 diabetes into remission. That's probably a relatively obvious one. And then finally, the idea of an artificial pancreas, something which actually produces insulin in response to sensors, which actually much more closely mimics what would happen if you had a pancreas that was behaving normally. And this one actually seems to me not a particularly big, difficult technological leap. Insulin is relatively straightforward. Injecting it is relatively straightforward. Sensing glucose is relatively straightforward. And these days, all of us wear on our belts or in our pockets computers that are easily capable of doing this. So all of these are areas where we could move on. But with diabetes, I think my summary would be, here is a serious disease. It has risen substantially, so it is now one of the biggest diseases groups in the UK and virtually every area of the world. This is not just a rich world problem. It is largely preventable if we could reverse global weight back to where it was some decades ago, if for type 2 diabetes. We are getting a lot better at preventing the complications of diabetes or delaying them and at treating them when they're there, but it remains a serious disease. And I think we have to make a decision as a society whether we wish to take on the minor or occasionally moderate inconveniences to do with trying to reduce energy intake for the whole population or not. But if we do not, the probability is that obesity rates in this country and globally will continue to rise, and therefore diabetes with all its complications will also continue to rise. And that, of course, would be a very serious problem. Thank you very much.